Okay, all right. So as Dr. Bob was saying, there is a kingdom of Ayodhya, okay, which was, classical, more Hindu-based museum, a kingdom era, okay, and Sukhothai was the Thai people. No, it's not clearly clear. The original Thai people probably migrated out of China, but that's really, I wasn't able to find all the evidence of it. And then later on, Ayodhya disappeared around 1767, as it said. And then the dynasty was established was Chakri. That again means circle, basically. It's a dynasty, different dynasty. It's like change from Stuart to Tudor. That was not a dramatic change, but and it's still, and Thailand still has an official king, even though they're democratic, and it's strict. I mean, anything abusing the king is punishable by prison and even serious sentences. So you cannot badmouth the king. You can make cartoons about Prince Charles, but in Thailand it's a no-no. Okay, and so the kings are still very much revered, and it's a varieties of, and so all the kings were named Rama, which is again that based on the Hindu epic Rama the first, Rama the second, Rama the fourth, and finally when he modernized, and there was enough coup, so that's when he finally decided to give up the absolute monarchy, and a somewhat more popular based government was established in 1932. Okay, so that's the change had taken place, but still, king has a lot more authority than it does in Britain. Okay. Okay, and these are some of the temples of Thailand, of the reclining Buddha, which is, you can see that this, it says about 45 meters, so that would have to be, say, about 100, 130 feet type thing. So, and when I went to Thailand, I have seen this, that is just amazing tourist spot, that thing. Okay, and there are varieties of other temples in Chiang Mai. Okay, and Bangkok has also numerous temples which are worth visiting.
If you're learning about world religions, you'll hit the jackpot in Thailand. The country is filled with magnificent Buddhist temples, some dating back centuries, others much, much younger. The temples in Thailand are made of wood, stone, and even recycled beer bottles, yet they all offer a sense of peace to all who visit. In this video, we explore the most stunning temples in Thailand. We've collected a list of the top stunning temples in Thailand, so make sure to include them in your list if you're a visitor. At first in the list, number 1, White Temple. The White Temple, Wat Rong Kun, is a gorgeous gingerbread creation that is one of the newest temples in Thailand, being built in 1997. Reminiscent of a fairy tale castle covered with snow, it might be the ogre's home since statuary has a ferocious look. A highlight of this privately owned temple is the Bridge of the Cycle of Rebirth, under which outstretched hands reach to the sky. Across the bridge is the Gate of Heaven, where 2 creatures decide the fate of the dead. Number 2, Temple of the Reclining Buddha. With more than 1,000 images, Bangkok's Temple of the Reclining Buddha hosts the largest collection of Buddhas in Thailand, including a reclining Buddha that is 45 meters long. Built on an island close to the Grand Palace, the temple complex is considered the best of the best royal temples. Wat Pho is one of Bangkok's oldest temples and is considered the birthplace of Thai massage. An early center for public education, walls are decorated with inscriptions on various subjects. Number 3, Wat Phra That Doi Suthep. Wat Phra That Doi Suthep is one of the must-sees when you're visiting Chiang Mai. One of the most sacred temples in northern Thailand, the temple's name is frequently shorted to Doi Suthep, although this is actually the name of the mountain it's sitting on. The temple, about 15 kilometers from Chiang Mai, is a working Buddhist monastery that was built in the 14th century. The top of the temple is decorated with a golden spire, surrounded by shrines and murals. A replica of the Emerald Buddha is on display. Number 4, Wat Chai Wat Thanara. Wat Chai Watthanaram is an impressive temple complex in Ayutthaya, an ancient capital of Thailand. Built to honor a king's mother, the temple is the most visited site in Ayutthaya. Wat Chai Watthanaram is located on the banks of the Chao Phraya River, but the scenic river is no competition with the temple. The layout of the 17th century temple subscribes to the traditional Buddhist view of the world, with temples corresponding to mountains, continents, seas, and human habitat. Number 5, Wateroo. Wateroo is known as the Temple of Dawn, but it might just as easily be known as the Temple of Magnificence. This temple, rising above the Chao Phraya River in Bangkok, is nothing short of spectacular when it's lit up against the night sky. One of Thailand's landmarks, the temple is just as stunning when lit up by the morning sun. The Mare-style tower, covered with colorful porcelain, glistens in the sun. Surrounding buildings are covered in seashells and more porcelain. Number 6, Wat Mahathat. Sukhothai. Wat Mahathat, located in northern Thailand's Sukhothai Historical Park, is an ancient temple that is considered the park's most important and impressive temple. Some 168 sculptings of Buddhist disciples with hands clasped decorate the base of the main stupa, which was built to contain relics belonging to Buddha. This is fitting as the name translates as Temple of the Great Relic. A large sitting Buddha can be found at Orientation Hall, while a huge standing Buddha is nearby. Number 7, Temple of the Emerald Buddha. The Temple of the Emerald Buddha, Wat Phra Kaew, may be misnamed because the only thing in common the Buddha has with emerald is the color green. The 66 centimeters high Buddha, instead, is made of jasper or jade. Still, it occupies the place of honor in this temple on the Grand Palace grounds. The Buddha, clad in gold, is believed to date back to the 15th century. It was moved to various temples around Thailand for a few centuries, ending up in Bangkok in 1784. Number 8, Temple of a Million Bottles. The Temple of a Million Bottles, Wat Pa Maha Chedi Ker, isn't your usual Buddhist temple. Indeed, it is one of the more unique temples you'll find in Thailand. The complex incorporates about 1.5 million recycled glass bottles in its design. Glass bottles are even used in the toilets. Mainly green Heineken and brown Chang bottles are used. Bottle caps are used to create mosaics. The complex has about 20 buildings, including prayer rooms and a water tower. Number 9, Wat Phra That Lampang Luang. Wat Phra That Lampang Luang is one of the most sacred temples in Thailand, home to a strand of Buddha's hair. It also is considered one of the best examples of Lana architecture. The 13th century temple has a conical spire or stupa that is more than 400 meters high. While other temples have been modernized, this temple has been restored to its original form. At last on the list, number 10, Sanctuary of Truth. The Sanctuary of Truth in Pattaya gives new meaning to the word impressive. Intricate carving cover every inch of the wood structure, which is filled with traditional Buddhist and Hindu decorations. It is a newer temple, a work in progress. It began in 1981 and is scheduled to be completed in 2050. Its aim is to honor the traditional ancient values of earth, knowledge, and Eastern philosophy by teaching about human responsibility, thought, cycle of life, and life's relationship with the universe. Now it's time to hear from you. What's your favorite stunning temple?
Okay, so that's now this it moves on to Vietnam. And Vietnam was the northern influence, Chinese, which is Dai Viet. Okay, and the southern one, which is modern day Vietnam, which was more Indian influence. As I talked about earlier, the one in yellow, you can see that some of the names are very, called Indianized kingdom of Champa, Champa. Okay. And all the names are, really basically Sanskrit based. You can just see from here. If I can zoom down, in Indra, which I talked about, and so all of these names are relatively easy for me to understand or translate. And you can see at the same time the Laotian monk kingdom. I showed you this slide earlier. So the territory was being exchanged substantially, and the kingdoms appeared. And this gives you the idea. We talked about the Pagan kingdom, okay, and you can see in south. This is modern day Malaya, the Strait of Malacca, okay, and we'll talk a little bit about this Sri Vijaya temple a little later on, and South China Sea. So it gives you an idea of, and obviously, all of you are familiar with the Gulf of Tonkin, okay, from the Vietnam War. So this gives you the orientation of the geography of that area, okay, and and their big problem is, they are a little bit like, next to a giant neighbor. They're being next door to China. So they've been attacked half a dozen times with China. The Chinese just send down, thousands of people. So they've fought varieties of wars starting from, in last 2,000 years with China, until very recently. So from 6th to the 15th century, continuous ongoing conflict with Dai Viet, Khmer Empire. And so then finally, okay, so okay, excuse me, I think I have to move my notes here. Okay. So, and then there was another area, part of it gradually, became, complete, the southern kingdom of Champa became part of, what is modern day Vietnam. And it ended up being a French colony. Okay. And some of this was, lost to time. But later on, in 1940, in the Mekong Delta, the Vietnamese earlier culture evidence was, I'm not going to pronounce EO or something. So how I would, so this was discovered, and these were Roman as well as Hindu, coins and cultures were discovered. And this may have been due to part of a kingdom in southern China, which was a kingdom which was considered Funan. And people the experts are in controversy as to what exactly was Funan. But the general consensus is it is part of, a Chinese type empire, not necessarily controlled from north, but an independent empire of Funan, which, is accepted. Okay. And these are, the two cultures of Vietnam, Champa culture, which we talked about, I continued the Hinduist culture. Okay. And I think I showed you the part of it already. Okay. Moving on to the next one, which is the big, like thousands of island, which is modern day Indonesia, and there were varieties of kingdoms that again independently developed, some Hindu, some Buddhist, okay, starting from 4th century until about 1500, when finally, and Islam took over of 90% of, Indonesia. So Indonesia is one of the largest Muslim, countries in the world. And just recently I was, and but unlike other countries, they're still a little bit much more tolerant. The other faiths are allowed to practice. So it's a more laid back type of Islam. And even though just a couple of days ago I read in The Economist that people are by voluntarily turning to more conservative type of Islam. Okay, part of it is becoming more Sharia law, not little less in Indonesia, but a lot more in the Malay states. Malaya or Malaysia is a composite of varieties of states which were originally sultanates. And just like in the United States, different states can have different laws. Some states have a very strict, Islamic Sharia law. So the word in that part of the world, which was a lot more tolerant during the British era, and even after independence, is becoming a lot more Islamicized, so, and that I was just I just read it a couple of days ago in The Economist. They do a good job of covering whole world. So this was, earlier history of, and it took about from, and a lot of, how did Islam spread from to Indonesia? Along trade. Traders from South India, which were Arabic, gradually moved to modern day Malaya, Indonesia, and then obviously the conversion took place. And part of it may have been, that people were opposed to the caste rigidity of Hinduism, and Islam was a lot more tolerant, as anybody can be. Although this recently, I read a huge tome about slavery in Islam. Okay, so it's a huge amount of, Islam was big into trading slaves. It's right from the start of Islam type thing. But unlike the slavery in the West, slaves could rise on to become almost a caliph. Okay, so there was a room for improvement if you are more pious and other things. And there was a big division that took place between the two branches of Islam, that as to who was going to be. And one branch promised that if you are a good Muslim, you could rise on to become a caliph. On the other branch insisted on, said you have to be descendant of Muhammad. So there was a big division that took place between the branches of Shia versus Sunni. And I'm sure most of you know which is the biggest Shiite kingdom. Iran, right? Exactly. So that was, Iran is, and and there was a huge, and fortunately, the part of the Muslim rule in India was a lot more Persian based, so Shia based. So they were more laid back, than and then later on when the Mongols came, there were a lot more Sunni influence, and when the Turks came, they were very hardline Sunni influence. Okay. But the Shiites were more laid back, they loved like the poems of Omar Khayyam, the wine and thou besides me, type of thing. So there was a lot more, and there were the Sufis, the dervishes were turned around. So that was a different type of Islam. Okay. And people, lived substantially in harmony for a while. So in fact, my mom still has a old flat in a city north of Bombay, and her neighbors are Islamic, they've adopted Hindu culture. They speak the local languages, they don't all observe Sharia. And so it was a reasonably harmonious this thing. So, but I think that's another lecture. Okay, I have sent in a proposal to Joseph about India and the United States, 250 years. So I may do that class on Zoom in September if you're interested, so I'm going to get back to, from Cornwallis to Bodhi, basically. So I'm going to try to cover this whole area, that thing. So this is, okay. Now, when I started looking at this is the word I heard. Had anybody heard the word thalassocracy before? That was new to me. I mean, you may know because you're a history person type of thing, but that was new to me type of thing. You two are history teachers, but there was a sea-based, ocean-based empire, there wasn't a land-based empire, so they controlled the sea route. So this was considered the two Indonesian islands, one was Sumatra and based in Srivijaya. So this was, and they controlled the sea routes between China and India and Europe. Okay, and Arabia. So, they had the sea power. So they were probably pirates who had established kingdom, you can say that. But so there was the thalassocracy. So I had to look up the words. What are they talking about, So, but this was again, so, and they, forced to be reckoned with, they were, even the great Chinese emperors, they gave them, I think they accepted tribute to them, and they didn't think, so they were especially the Sri Vijaya kingdom was a force to be reckoned with for several hundred years, from 8th century to around 1200 when Islam took over. So this is, out of Sumatra, initially Buddhist, and the learning centers, and they controlled the trade. So that was the big thing, because, it's like, what Iran is doing, they were doing it, a few hundred years before. And this was the southern kingdom of Java, okay. And again, they dominated the further eastern part, okay. And hopefully this will play.
Buddhist cosmology, the Borobudur temple compound. The island of Java, Indonesia, Mount Merapi, meaning red fire, is an active volcano. The temple complex was rediscovered by the British in 1814. It is known as Borobudur among the local people. The base is a 1,200 square meter terrace topped with 6 tiers. The walls are adorned with numerous Buddha reliefs. The total length of the galleries when placed end to end stretches for 5 kilometers. Borobudur was probably built between the 8th and 9th centuries. The exact purpose of its construction is not clear. One theory is that the complex represents Buddhist cosmology. It's a mandala. A group of reliefs hidden at the back of lined stones at the base were discovered in 1885. It was a significant discovery. The words ugly face are inscribed in ancient Javanese script. It describes the earthly world dominated by greed. The monument represents the 3 worlds of Buddhist cosmology. The base level is the world of desire. The world of forms is above. Then comes the world of formlessness, the highest level of enlightenment. As visitors walk across the gallery, they enter the world of forms. They can see images of people trying to achieve mastery over worldly desires. The daughters of the author of evil, opposed to Buddha, are trying to seduce him. He absorbs himself in meditation, convinced they are illusions of his own mind. As visitors progress and reach the top level, the gate to the world of formlessness awaits. Stupas appear amid the world of formlessness. 72 are neatly lined. Statues of Buddha are hidden inside. They can be glimpsed through the grate. There is a 10-meter-high stupa at the top of the monument. Standing right at the center of Borobudur, it encourages Buddhists the world over to strive for enlightenment with diligence.
So it's NHK is a Japanese news service, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. And so this was, you got the idea about, he describes it very nicely. And this was basically rice culture as well as, spices and varieties of dyes. Okay. So, all right. Okay. And then again, now a big force that started, which all of you are familiar with, the rise of the Genghis Khan, and he not only controlled Central Asia, they started out of, Eastern Central Asia and marched, there are some ferocious warriors who had the mastery of the horses, and, and they made their, on the tails of the Muslim arrival from the Caliphate, that they invaded India as well. Okay. And there was, horrendous, slaughter that he carried out along with looting, but somewhere along the line, he did not decide to establish a kingdom type of thing. And, and so this was one of the biggest raids that took place and created a huge amount of slaughter in northern India around, early 13th century. Okay. And now this is interesting, that the types of ships that were, the one that is called is Dhow, Dhow, is the jewel of Muscat, and people are still, like, even when I was growing up in the early 60s, you could see that if you go on the riverbanks, and this was obviously under the radar, because there's nobody could police them, because these were so tiny enough and the coast is so wide. There was a huge amount of smuggling that went on, because from the modern day United Arab Emirates to the western coast of Bombay and and Pakistan. And last but not the least, in 2008, when the terrorist attack took place in Bombay to the central railway station as well as the Jewish synagogue, these people traveled in those basically, and and the Navy obviously didn't show up on the radar. Okay. And there were varieties of lug nuts. It was initially tried with ropes made from from tree bark, okay, and jute, and then later on wooden nails were used because iron was much later. So the varieties of, and this on the other hand, the Australasian shipping was totally different. They were the outriggers that you've seen in Kontiki, and the people who went. So a different type of boat construction took place. Now, again, so these are currently still being used by the local seafaring culture. And now, and this was the earliest evidence on the ship on the wall of the Borobudur. Okay, and the Chinese, when they did it, obviously they did it in their mega scale, as Chinese have been known to do. Their ships were a lot larger. They accommodated thousands of men. Okay, and that's what they were called, the Chinese junk, Junk. And that word, and they and they were like different layers. So one type could be made watertight, so they couldn't get flooded, and they were accompanied by other ships. So in case there is a disaster, a climatic disaster, that people could be saved. So their scale of shipbuilding, when they got into it, it was huge. But then all of a sudden, the emperor changed his mind. Okay, we do not want any trade. We have everything we need. Thank you very much. And so that was, okay. But I'll have one interesting slide about it as well, and then, okay, I think what is okay. Okay, I think we've already shown about the trade routes type of thing that just went around, so the Chola Empire. So I'm sorry, I already showed this. Okay, and obviously, Java was one of the few islands that was left outside, the Islamic influence. Okay, and that continued to be Hindu kingdom for a long time, and then even then, the Islamic influence was stronger and stronger. So what the Hindu followers did, they moved to an island called Bali. Okay, so Bali is still one of the few islands which is strongly Hindu in the Indonesian archipelago. Okay, and these are varieties of things that have been discovered in modern day Indonesia. Okay. Okay, now all the trade was basically, it was peaceful trade. There were pirates locally, but most of the people, the wars were fought on the land. The Persians and the Romans fought, but they fought on the land. On the side, they continued to trade, albeit restricted, but the trade continued. The same time, the Arabs and the Hindu kingdoms, obviously, there were Muslim sultanate in North India and Hindu kingdom in South. They fought with each other, but the trade-wise, that continued. When the Muslim sultans wanted to go to Hajj, to Mecca, they traveled through the Hindu ports. Okay, so that was the same way. The trade with Southeast Asia also, trade is different than the land warfare. Okay, all that changed in 1498. Okay, because on the tales of Columbus, what happened was Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese, decided to round the Cape of Good Horn. And the story was that he didn't have any idea of the route once he went down south to Cape of Good Hope. He was assisted by an Indian sailor who was able to translate, and he showed, yeah, I'll show you how to navigate, and the rest is history. And at the same time, the first thing was, they just thought, basically, they thought the temples, they thought these were churches, okay? And his famous statement was, we say Christians and spices. And they were also looking for, Prester John, the Nestorian Christian concept. There was a belief that, the Prester John had gone to convert people, around, 600 AD or something. So they were looking for Nestorians. And they did find churches, which was the Greek Orthodox churches, Syrian Christian, but obviously, being good Catholic, they didn't think they were the right kind of Christians. So they wanted to convert them as well. Okay, so this was this. Okay, and then and then he some of the tributes that he gave it to the Indian prince, called Zamorin, which was a kingdom of Calicut. The word calico comes from Calicut, okay, which is one of the ports on South India. Okay, so that's where the calico cloth comes from. So the gifts that they came, and 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 the king's handlers, they just, oh, these are laughable gifts. I mean, an ordinary merchant would give this type of gifts. What are you bringing? Some wool cloth and some glass trinkets? I mean, you're supposed to bring gold, when you come to the king as a tribute. So, it didn't go very well the first time. And then the second time around, and there was some local skirmish because the Arabs who controlled the sea trade, they were not willing to allow this, newcomers to get foothold. So some skirmish took place, and finally the Portuguese decided to use their gunpowder, and they had better weaponry. So they were able to dictate their term, and finally the local princes who were not divided, saw that these people had better gunpowder, so they decided to seek assistance of the Portuguese, giving them the right to establish various forts. And those were the several colonies that were established, which came to be Goa, another town called Diu, D-I-U, Diu, and Daman. So those were the three Portuguese control areas that remained under Portuguese control from 1498 to 1963. Okay, and even after the end, obviously, after when the British Empire took over, the Portuguese were spent up force, and very quickly within 100 years they were replaced by the Dutch, and the Dutch who were replaced by the Brits, and the rush for colonies was absolutely like a madhouse, like the rush for Africa that took place in the 20th and 19th century. Even the tiny little Denmark had colonies on the east coast of India. Okay, I mean, you wouldn't think that Denmark would be, but yes, they were interested in colonizing this thing. The Belgians there was not much the Belgian presence, but the French was very much there. I talked about Pondicherry earlier. So this was, the rise of European influence. Okay, and this shows trade and religion follow. So I just put in this slide about the huge prominence of Islam. You can see this 229 million in Indonesia, 22 million in Malaysia, and as I mentioned earlier, Singapore and others. And the biggest, one of the big rich kingdom of Brunei, has substantial presence. And the last but not the least, East Timor, okay, is the most recent independent, kingdom, which is Islam, which has a small presence of Islamic. Okay. Okay. And now at the same time, what was going on in India, the various sultanates, where various dynasties were taking place. The first entry was out of Sindh, which is on the border of Iran and modern day Pakistan, occurring around 700 current era. And it took about 300-400 years for the various Rajput kingdoms of North India to lose one by one. And the Rajputs are actually people who are Scythians, the Indo-Scythians who traveled from Central Asia and established various ports of Rajasthan and kingdom. So this was, Islamic, and obviously, that was a huge cultural fight. But gradually, cultural tolerance took place, not necessarily mixture, but tolerance, because the Islamic sultans decided we're not going to be able to control 80% of the population. So at least, and we can't kill all of them either. So they said, okay, they put in something called the jizya tax. So they had to pay tax for being not people of the book. Okay. But at the same time, the Hindu population was, were not secured to elite jobs. That just went to Turks and Persians, who came from north. But at the same time, the Rajputs decided to make peace with the Sultanate and collaborated as their soldiers. So the cultural mixture that took place. Okay. And not just Genghis Khan, but another powerful king, obviously you've heard of the Great Timur Lane out of Samarkand. who plundered Delhi, a couple of 100 years later after Genghis Khan. Okay. And, again, left in one day, left 100,000 dead. Okay. And that had a huge impact on the Islamic thing. But for whatever reasons, he decided not to stay, just loot and go back to Central Asia. At the same time, Zhang Zai, he's a Chinese Muslim, and this was one of the big forays of the Chinese into exploring the Indian Ocean trade. Okay, I mean, you have to admire it. They traveled with 208 ships. Okay, I mean, just nothing in a small scale. So, and he did varieties of voyages. Starting from southern China all the way to Mozambique. So he, before, I mean, Columbus traveled with about three small ships. I mean, when the Chinese went around, 208 ships with thousands of people. And, the first voyage around 1405 to 1407, okay? And then in Jiangsu province, he started westward, okay? And it went first to Vietnam, okay? Again, got a gift for the king, and vice versa. The gift giving was continued and traveled westward to Cochin, South India. Again, the southern Indians realized Chinese emperor was a force to be reckoned with. They gave them tribute. That's all that they wanted. They didn't want to establish political control necessarily, okay? And then went all the way around Sri Lanka, of which is Ceylon, and varieties of exotic animals, including a giraffe from Africa that was taken all the way to the court of the great Khan. Okay, so this were, and he not only that, he continued several voyages, and he was a Chinese Muslim, and this is his statue somewhere in southern China. Okay, okay. What was happening on the other side? Along the Portuguese, the variety of Jesuits went along with the Portuguese, and the one that is well known is Saint Francis Xavier, and he came to Goa in 1542, and he was quite successful in converting, obviously because of the caste distinction, the lower caste of the Indian subcontinent. But they were very, very acceptable to convert into Christianity because they were at the lowest end of the totem pole. Okay, and there were varieties of debates that were carried out with Brahmin scholars, and they didn't have, because they were on the top. They were the top dogs. They had no reason to convert. Okay, so and then from later on, he got somewhat fed up with it and decided to go for larger a bunch of heathens to Malaya and China. So so he traveled extensively, and he was still a force to be named, to be very recognized. Varieties of prestigious Jesuit freestanding colleges in Western India are Xavier colleges. Those were like the prize institutions to get into. So his name is still very respected. Okay, I think yeah, we should. I just have a few more slides, so we should be able to. Okay, and I talked about like spice trade. The nutmeg. This is we talked about. Let's see if I can show this. Oh, sorry. Okay, this is Indonesia. You can just see that we already showed the top big island on the left side is Sumatra. Okay, and Borneo. Okay, you can see. And now amongst that, this little areas that are circled. No, this is called Banda Islands. Okay, Banda. Just that little dot that you showed. Okay, okay. And from there, even amongst there, this is the smallest island called Run. Okay, you can see how tiny dot that is. In the middle of the Indian Ocean. That was the island of Nutmeg. Okay. So this was the big prize thing for the Dutch. Okay. And the Dutch and the Brits fought hands in hand for this little island. Okay. Because the nutmeg was the profits that were to be made were like thousands% profit, the type of thing for sending it to Europe. So this was the big, and so King James, and so, and this was, like what I explained to you about, that this was traded for Manhattan during the Anglo-Dutch Wars, okay, type of thing. So, and that, they would cut off the trees, and it's at first, and this was amazing how with the fart, they actually tortured other Europeans, And this was one of the first documented example of water torture that was done in Iraq War. Okay, so there was an example of Amboyard massacre. They killed some, Chinese, servants of the Dutch company, and so and some of the, so it's an example of as to how the Prophet said, okay. Next was, in 15, because I had promised I would talk briefly from Indus to Taj, so I have to see if I have to include, because this can be a full talk, and I've already done the class of history of India several years ago. So, but in 1526, from Samarkand, modern day Samarkand, in one of the in the Central Asia, Babur, the Mughal prince, decided to travel via Afghanistan, and was able to, they had better, gunpowder technology and better guns and better arrows. Okay, so they were able to defeat the Muslim Empire, and the rise of the so-called glorious Mughal era of India. It started from 1526 until finally the Brits put an end to it in 1857. So they were in power for almost 350 years. Okay, and again, their kingdom was mostly in the north, and central, all the way from Afghanistan. And south, some of the emperors did travel all the way to south, but again, their supply lines were stretched, so they were never able to control it completely. Some of them were very tolerant. The one person named Akbar, who was very tolerant, and he even thought, he invited Jesuits, Christians, Zoroastrians, Hindus, and for discussion. Okay, and but his sons were a lot more orthodox. The mullahs had a lot more power. So after his death, after Akbar, who ruled in 1605, okay, and that was a time when the East India Company was formed. The Queen Elizabeth I gave them the charter, and they went with their hats in their hand asking for trade permits to the emperor. They landed in, a city which is between this area called Surat, okay, and they've traveled by land to the court of Delhi. They were kept waiting for about 8 months. Finally, the great emperor, because that Mughal Empire was, next to China, there was one of China and India had the two largest economies at that time, because England was relatively a small island type of thing, so they didn't have, they had some imports from the colonies, but sugar primarily, but there was pre-industrial revolution, so they were seeking for trade permits, for cotton and silk. Okay, finally they had given up that the spice was not worth it. Cotton was a lot more, cotton, indigo, saltpeter were a lot more lucrative trade. Okay, for gunpowder they needed saltpeter, okay, which was that nitrate type of compound, and indigo for dye, okay, was very popular, and cotton. So they traded cotton to Africa for slaves, and the slaves to the colonies, to the 13 colonies. So it was a triangular trade that took place, okay, from the East India Company. And again, there was a first private enterprise. Okay, and we talked about Akbar the Great, and so he invited varieties of, and he liked the Christian philosophy, but he had no interest in, converting, basically. In fact, so much so, he went and decided to start his own religion, okay, and that petered out, with the rise of the more traditional Islam. They didn't think that the king was out of his mind, so, so his ideas did not take hold, basically. So he decided he wanted to build a bridge, type of thing, but again, unfortunately, it did not pan. Okay. Okay. Now, Catholicism in Goa, converts those. And some of the Jews, who are this thing, they also migrated to Goa. Okay. And again, there were new Hindu kingdoms, and the the idea just continued for several hundred years. We talked about Saint Xavier. Okay. And this is somebody who's a Monty Python fan may realize, okay. This is from Monty Python. Oh, okay. No, who's the Spanish Inquisition? Who's afraid of the Inquisition? I think so. And this was the Conversios had a big this thing. So, and this is read into another this thing. So this was an interesting that one of the Jesuits, came Roberto di Nobili, So he was, obviously a missionary, but he decided, okay, well, instead of arguing with this, I will adapt to their custom. So he became almost like, adopted local customs, actually gave a nod or tolerance to the so-called casteism system, so much so that, Rome or Vatican did not like it. He was considered as a white Brahmin. Okay. So his efforts were, sort of, not looked upon kindly by Vatican. Okay. So it was, Roberto di Nobilis. I read a book about, guns and missionaries. This was written by an English historian. This was just somehow I ran into this book, Guns and Missionaries in South Asia. So it was an interesting, very scholarly book that I just came across last summer. Okay. So this was I'm sorry. Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, we have 10 minutes still. So yeah, I just have 3 or 4 slides. So we should, okay. So this was, he adopted local customs. He learned the local Sanskrit language as well as Tamil. Okay. And much to the chagrin of the Pope. At the same time, there was a Lutheran minister. Okay. He traveled, to South India. And again, he was a lot more, rigid in his system, not surprising being Lutheran. Okay. And he was sent by the Danish king. Okay. And he established a printing press. And, he really, but we have to give him credit, persisted in trying to convert with very limited success. But one thing he did was he did write, translate the Bible into local Tamil language, which is the predominant language of South India. Okay. And somehow along the line, he was, in spite of all the arguments and discussions that he had with the enlightened Brahmins, he was never able to convince into superiority because they questioned, the virgin birth concept, and that just did not wash well with the people who are used to polytheism or there's as though or one God concept, Okay. And this was, the great Thomas Roe, who was the initial East India Company people did not get cut much mustard with the Mughal king. So finally, Queen Elizabeth decided to send an upper class gentry, Sir Thomas Roe. He went with all the royal, with the gifts from the Queen, with the horses and other these things from Europe. And finally, he was given a coat to the Emperor Jahangir, who was, the son of Akbar. And, and he was, after a while, he was granted, rights to establish what they call factories, which is the trading post on west coast of India. And as I mentioned last time, that the Mughals were a land-based empire. They never understood the importance of sea trade coast. They had no clue that this giving foothold to the European powers with better technology and other stuff is going to come back and bite them in 100 years or so. So they were, so there was, okay. And he went with, style basically, so to impress. Okay. And his son, okay, was a rather romantic emperor named Shah Jahan, who was addicted to alcohol as well as opium. Okay. And he was romantic, and and even Jahangir, so these people were, really much more laid back kings, and his queen, the Jahangir's queen, actually literally ran the state, so we can say. And that again did not go well with the Islamic clergy, basically. And Shah Jahan was, enamored with his wife Mumtaz, who died after childbirth. So in her memory, he built the great Taj Mahal. Okay, so that is the big and it happened a lot of time in dynasties. He was imprisoned by his own son. Okay? So he stayed across the river. Okay, blazing as his masterpiece creation of all marble. Okay, and and he died as a prisoner of his son. Okay. Okay, and these are some of the facts about Taj Mahal. It was built, and on the river, it took, as you can see, it took about 20 years, and it's a mixture of both Hindu and Muslim culture. You can see the flower design and other stuff. and some of the names that were written by the people who did the work, Okay. So this was so it controls, it has the graves. And unfortunately, with the pollution of the city, that is a problem. So I think we are done in 5-6 minutes earlier. So I had, I think I missed one video of Angkor Wat did not play, but otherwise everything else played, so. Okay, folks, thank you. I had fun. And hopefully I'll see you sometime on Zoom, perhaps. Okay. Okay, and meeting